Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk on being creative with malicious office macros. So for you, those of you that do not know me, my name is TJ Null, and I have been a pen tester in the private sector in the US for about. So for you, those of you that do not know me, Mystikcon, I can hear you in the background. Null, and I have been a pen tester in the private sector in the US for about. Mystikcon, I can hear you in the background. Okay, there we go. Sweet. So anyways, I've been a pen tester in the private sector for about 8 years now. I'm also the community manager for offensive security, and I teach at a local community college for ethical hacking and Linux fundamentals. But outside of that, I mostly like to compete in cyber competitions and hosting cyber competitions here in the local DMV area and attending security conferences when I can, either virtual or on site. And outside of InfoSec, because you got to have hobbies, right? Hiking and traveling is one of my big things I love to do. Playing lacrosse and playing video games is something I also like to do just to, get myself out of the space that I'm in here now. So what are we going to be talking about, right? Creating malicious macros, right? With Microsoft Office, right? So before I get into the deep dive of some of the techniques I'm going to be going through, well, and also some stuff that I'm going to be talking about, I have an agenda set in place where we got to understand some history about where macros came from, right? And where we are now. Also, places to find macro samples, because there's a lot of interesting techniques that people use, even APT groups, that have a lot of different things that they go ahead and use to bypass antivirus or to make sure that they get their payload onto disk or to memory. And then also try to figure out, how we can build our own. So getting into the history of macros, right? Macro malware. 1995, 1999, they were pretty harmless, right? Back then, it used to just be, you troll your friends. You would write a little message box in there that says, I pwned you, right? And then it started getting a little bit bigger where, some people thought macros were extinct. Like no one's doing anything with them. No one's running any malware. But that really then kicked off, from 2006 to 2014. And really some of the malware that we still see out there today still uses some same techniques and the same exact paths, try to get into, clients and corporate networks that are out there today. So where are we now with macro malware itself? Well, they're still being used in the wild. They're still being used on engagements. They're still being used constantly on malware campaigns. I mean, I recently just saw that Emotet is now back, apparently, from the rumors that had. And they're trying to actually load Trojan TrickBot malware onto the system itself. So, but there's various commodities of malware families like DataBot, GoZ, TrickBot, right? They use these techniques, right, to gain a strong positions in the target network. So that form of malware basically just leaves the door open for other possibilities, right? So we could have, specific groups that have a set of bots, that can be able to run ransomware attacks, right? And also other campaigns, right, to keep their persistence onto those network itself. We still have macros still running simple malware obfuscation techniques. Zor, base64, rot13, I've seen base85 as well too recently, has become a big one that people are starting to use, so that AV vendors or, AV for itself, can't be able to detect, the signatures that are on those macros, right? And same thing in Microsoft Office. Some macros are still created with old versions. Doc 2003 to 2007. Doc and XLS files have a better chance of actually bypassing AV defenses. And then macros that can call Win32 API calls. Those are fun. Those are fun if you ever get a chance to start interacting and adding your own API calls into macros that can actually be able to bypass malware itself. And then, the recent one that we started seeing was XL 4.0 macros, right? You can execute commands in the cell sheet itself. And then what it will do basically is walk through each of the cells to execute your commands. Now, there's been a lot of different campaigns that have gotten a little bit more stealthy with their stuff by hiding their cells, or implementing characters in, the VBA that go ahead and execute their program or the commands that they want to try to get access to the system itself. So to give you an example of what an XL 4.0 macro looks like, I try to take a simple, basic approach to this. So what it is basically, all you do is you open up Excel, right? And you go ahead and right click on one of the sheets and you insert. And in the insert, you can actually go ahead and select macro 4.0 Excel. And then what happens then is that Macro 4.0 Excel will go ahead and create a sheet that has a macro built into it. And in the cells, all you have to do is just pop in a few different lines of code that you want, like exe cmd.exe, put an alert in, return, and then go ahead and save the file. When the user opens that file, right, their command starts spitting out once they enable the content there. So this right here in the screenshot that I have actually depicts Microsoft Office 2021 Professional Plus still using Excel 4.0 macros. Now, apparently, Microsoft has decided that they said that they are going to be getting rid of Excel 4.0 macros. And if that's going to be the case, well, it's still here now. And also versions of Microsoft still probably have it where you can still utilize it. And a recent thing that also came out too that I want to mention is that Microsoft is looking to plan to actually enable and implement JavaScript that you can now run through macros. So anybody who loves to use .NET to JavaScript is going to have a lot of fun trying to run stuff in macros with that. I haven't been able to test any of that yet at this time, but that's something I'm looking forward to do. That's one of my creative techniques, actually. So now that you guys have understanding of the history of macro malware, you know, where we are now with it, at least from what I've seen from my perspective, there could be things that I'm missing, and there's just so much out there for it. Where do you go find macro samples, right? Where do you start playing with them, right? So the one thing I want everybody to keep in mind is that if you're going to be playing with any macro samples, make sure you have a dirty box. Make sure you have a box that doesn't contain any personal or sensitive information, right? If you have a sandbox environment or you use, you know, specific program for your sandbox environment, I would totally recommend using that to go ahead and look at the macros that are out there. So I have a few sites that I wanted to share with you guys that this is what I pretty much use when I'm hunting down like legit macro samples that are out there that, you know, a lot of these malware campaigns use. App.any.run is my favorite. Create a free account. They have thousands of public tasks. You could definitely search, you know, either the file by a hash or by a set of string. And there's a couple filters that I use to go ahead and find macros that are out there. So keywords to filter when you're looking for macros is macros dash on dash open. DDE are still running around. Maldoc and generated doc are key keyword searches that you could use to go ahead and filter out all the different macros and also malicious documents that app.any.run contains that you can go ahead and look through. Virus total is another one, right? Everybody loves to use it to upload through different AV signatures. The other thing too about it is that if you have a specific hash, right, from a threat intel report that you want to look and find that macro malware, virus total probably will have it. ICSSans.edu, their diary has constantly always different posts and talks about some of the macro malware that's out there or stuff that they've seen. And then a lot of people from that community really get together to talk about, okay, how do they, you know, figure out how this macro works? How do they debug it? How do they deobfuscate it? And a lot of those techniques that I read in those diaries are some stuff that I try to implement into my operations or my engagements that I have with clients. And then shout out to malwaretrafficanalysis.net. They have a good source of PCAPs. And surprisingly, why are you asking, you know, why we look at PCAPs? Well, PCAPs are really interesting because what malware traffic analysis has is that he has a load of these PCAPs that you could download and look through and sift through and see, you know, specific macro documents on how they call out, right? And also how they communicate. So in the past, Emotet would run most of their campaigns on the HTTP protocol. Now they're running recently, apparently, HTTPS for their stuff. And Brian has the actual PCAP and an article about that on ICSSans, if anybody wants to look at that, that talks about basically his walkthrough of what he's seen with how this new Emotet campaign is working with XL 4.0. So here is a live image, well, not live image, but a screenshot I took yesterday, actually 3 in the morning from app.any.run. This is one sample that I looked at from an old Emotet campaign. And in that Emotet campaign, you could see the different layers of obfuscation, code class names, right, on the left-hand side that they put in their macro. And then on the right-hand side, we go ahead and see the task of how it runs. So in that task, we see a call going to PowerShell.exe that's using the encode command. So it's running it through base64 to go ahead and execute that command. So we could take that PowerShell command and also decode it to look further to it. But I'm going to get into a little bit more about that stuff from there. And then, as I said before, right, this is actually a screenshot that I had from, I'm sorry, Brad, actually. malware traffic analysis, where he shows how basically Emotet has returned. If anybody wants to take a look at that article, check it out on the SANS ICS diary. It's a really good read for the recent campaigns that Emotet is trying to run with what they're doing for executing Office macros, either through, possibly through zip, docm, and through XLSM as well too. So now that I talked about where to find samples, right? Where do you want to go to check them out and look for other information? There's tools that you can use to go ahead and examine these macro samples. These are a few tools that I recommend. olydump.py is a good Python script. I can't remember the person who wrote it, but what it does basically is it pulls out any strings or streams in an Office document or XLS document or specific Office document in general, and it goes ahead and shows you a list of all the different macros that are there. And as you look through the list of macros that could be hidden, maybe not found, it'll go ahead and show them. And then you could go ahead and be able to review the contents of how that macro is running. What type of techniques are they doing? XLM macro deobfuscator is another tool that I started using recently to go ahead and actually decode XLM macros now recently. And it's been a really good tool that I've liked to use for XL 4.0 macros. And CyberChef is another good tool that I like to use as well for decoding payloads. So most of the time when macros are running, either if they're running PowerShell, WMI, or certutil, I like to find ways to use CyberChef to decode some of the obfuscation or the techniques that they've done. And the last thing, of course, I like to do is also use a hex editor. Sometimes malware campaigns will love to change certain bytes, and it will have in their macro code to change out and flip those bytes on the fly so that AV can't detect it, defenses can't detect it. And on the fly, it goes ahead and actually executes the macro. So there's been some pretty interesting malware, macro malware that's been out there that could do something like this. So here's an example of LEL dump I mentioned earlier, right? How it basically grabs the VBA from the XLS file here, right? And you can see all the different sheets, the projects that are in here, the VBA project, and also, what workbook is also there. So we could go ahead and take those VBA projects, try to extract the contents of the VBA project, and then see what code they're running, how they're, executing their macros, right? How they're bypassing defenses. We could see that there. And then here's another example that I wanted to take for using CyberChef. There's a lot of people in the, there's a lot of people in the InfoSec community that like to post their recipes for CyberChef that I like to take for any latest Emotet campaign or for any other malware campaigns that are out there that are using Office macros. So a person in the InfoSec community went by the name, I'm probably going to butcher this, Kostas, created a cool CyberChef recipe. And what this does is it easily extracting the URLs from the Word document that's downloaded from Emotet malware. Like I said, there's many other recipes out there that you could test out, against other types of macro malware. Sometimes, when I was working as a SOC analyst, we would write our own Python scripts that would go ahead and look through any of the bad or like false macros that some campaigns would have in place to find the legitimate one, and then try to break that so we could actually see what type of URLs are trying to call back home, right? So it can run its malware or anything else to grab from those sites itself. But we have to keep in mind that this threat landscape for macro malware constantly changes. I can't recall the last time Emotet has officially died. Emotet malware campaign has been around, at least from what I know, is 2010. And working as a SOC analyst before I was a pen tester, we would always get constantly hit with it. It was a nuisance. And then it would have like a break, like 2 weeks in, didn't see anything from Emotet. A lot of their URLs got busted. And then all of a sudden they would just show up. They would come back, right? So just keep in mind when you're looking at a lot of the macro malware that's out there, it's going to continue to change. And some of those techniques will be valuable that you could use on your pen test or red team operations as well too. So now that I talked about, those specific tools, right, for debugging and examining macro malware, right? I think I have an extra slide here. I'm sorry about that. Here we go. Tools to build your own macro payloads. That's the next thing I wanted to get into. There's a lot of tools that the InfoSec community has released publicly. And one of the main tools that I like to use for modifying macro malware or any specific code, for VBA, VBS that's used, Empire Framework is really great. MSF Venom, I still love to use to make VBA payloads. And if you could be able to modify the source in the Metasploit framework to go ahead and add some obfuscation techniques to your VBA payloads, sometimes Defender and other different defenses, EDR tools out there, might not find them because, of course, right? Everybody that like wants to run like Metasploit or Meterpreter, right, runs the default exploits or something that's already packed already there. So take some time to modify it, right? And you might have a lesser chance of being flagged or caught by AV itself. Empire Framework was another one. They have a really cool macro. I believe it was another macro payload that they had that I've used, but I haven't used in a while. Macro Pack is a tool that you can use to automate obfuscation and also generate like retro formats in old MS Office documents. So you could also run not just VBA, but even VBS like formats as well too. But what's really cool about their obfuscation is that they add what they do for their macros is that they rename their functions. They add also, they make different variables. They add custom API imports, and they do a lot of other things too. But keep in mind, these are public tools. These public tools are already flagged and signatured by AV. So if you want to get an idea of how to build your own, right, these are some good tools to at least get started. Another one I like to use is Evil Clippy, right? It's a cross-platform assistant tool, right? So it can be able to hide VBA macros. It could do VBA stomping, which is another macro malware technique. And also try to confuse macro analysis tools, right, that I showed you previously. A recent tool that I'm starting to use a lot more is XL in Donut, and that's for XL 4.0 macro generators. That's really good. So what it does is you could take your C# code that you have, so your C# payload that you write. So I like to usually do Metasploit. I'll go ahead and have a C# payload made, and I'll go ahead and throw that through XL Donut, and that will go ahead and save the macro as an XLS file, and we'll go ahead and when I go ahead and drop it, onto my campaign, it'll go ahead and run. So these are some tools that I like to use for testing for macro malware, and also just to get an understanding of how I can build my own. And really, I think that's what we're going to have to get to at this point. A lot of these tools that were shared publicly by the community are really great ideas, to understand, how macro malware is made still. How can we be able to bypass certain things? And really, most of the time, pretty much everyone has Microsoft Office installed on their system. So the next thing I want to get into is creating creative techniques for building macro payloads. So unfortunately for this talk, I had a bunch of other techniques that I submitted to Microsoft that I wanted to talk about, but unfortunately I am still waiting for Microsoft to get back to me on some of those that I have. And since that didn't happen, I am unfortunately not going to be able to share some of those, but I do have one technique that I at least want to share with you and some general tips that I have. So let's get started with some general tips here. So PowerShell is heavily scanned by AV and by AMZ, but there's still ways around it. We still can find ways to get through. Even if we don't go ahead and try to download the actual file itself, we can still invoke a web request, call the file itself, and have the file run directly from that server. And not have the file be saved on the disk. One other thing I want to mention too is pretexting is a great technique. And the reason why I say that is because, our job as pen testers and red teamers is to try to convince our target to open our malicious documents, right? We have to know what stuff we need to put into that document or how we could try to tell them that, hey, this is a very important file. There's confidential information into this, but we need you to enable the content so that this will go ahead and remove anything that's blanked out that you can then view the sensitive information, right? So pretexting is a good way to go ahead and have everything set onto your document. What I like to do usually for pretexting is I will go ahead and have another macro created. And inside that macro, what I will do is when the user enables content, I will go ahead and have that macro fill in auto text for me to make it look like it was actually a legit sensitive file. It was legit information that they had to read about. But in the back end, I have a second macro that runs. And that second macro goes ahead and runs my payload. It goes ahead and runs the dropper, gets my payload, and goes ahead and gives me a shell back. So if I could get that user to convince to enable the content and to open that file, then I'm set in, right? A lot of clients that I usually do pen tests for, mostly in finance and HR departments, sadly have their macro settings set to allow all macros to run and execute. This is a big no-no, and I wish a lot of people who are not technical or not in a security position would understand the security awareness and also the threats that could be involved when really that setting should not be enabled at all. So other things I like to do, running shellcode, or other things that I recommend not to do, running shellcode directly into macro is definitely going to get flagged, right? There's already signatures for it, right? If you try to run the default MSF Venom VBA payload into your macro, it's going to get flagged with your shellcode that you have. So try to modify it if you can. Another thing I like to do is set a delay on your macro. This one is fun because most of the time AV is always looking for a macro that auto opens. What I like to do usually is I actually wrote a function in my macros where I have a timer that's set and it goes ahead and delays the action once the user has enabled the content. So basically the process of what I do is when the user gets the file, they enable the content, the pretext starts first. And then once the pretext is done and shows up, then it goes ahead and it runs my macro with the set delay time, or it runs at a later time. The other thing I like to use, instead of using the auto open function, I'll actually use the auto close function. And with the auto close function, instead of the user, when they enable the content and they have the macro open, nothing runs on the back end. But when the user is done looking at that document or viewing it and they close that application, then my macro runs. Now, I haven't really seen, at least in the environments that I have tested and the operations that I've done, where they look for sub auto close, right? Macros usually try to detect for anything that runs immediately, quick, on action, auto fast, right? So that's one thing I would recommend is try to set delay, and then from your own payloads, try to create your own obfuscation tools. So there is a tool I'm going to go over a little bit today where we use our own obfuscation for our macros itself. So enough about me giving a lot of this pretext and all this information. Let me show you an actual macro that I have written that I did literally this morning. So in this macro we have here, this is for a Word document that we have. We have sub document open and we have sub auto open setup. The name of our macro is spawn. So what spawn does is spawn goes ahead and it downloads a file that I have set up on a server, right? And this is all done locally. This is what I do for testing. And so what it does is it downloads an obfuscated PS1 file. And when it downloads that file, or if it can make the connection from my web server, it'll go ahead then and download the file where the obfuscated file where the macro is actually placed. So the active document path goes ahead and prints out the actual path of where this document is located and will save my payload there. Then, as you see there in the wait 2 second, if we go down to the subsection here, let me see if I could use the laser pointer here. This right here is what I was talking about earlier about setting a delay. This sub wait function that I have here actually creates a timer that I have, and it goes ahead and loops and waits until that payload is downloaded. If I don't have this wait section here, the macro could go ahead and immediately download the file, but might not run it because it might not be done, right? So we need to have some time set for it to actually download the file. And then what I have then afterwards is I go ahead and I set an object for WSH shell to go ahead and run a WScript shell. That WScript shell will go ahead and then run with PowerShell our no exit file, and it runs our obfuscated PS1 file to go ahead and give me a reverse shell back. So this is pretty easy. I mean, you don't have to get really like super heavy into obfuscation, adding different, evasion techniques, right? Because a lot of things that are out there that EDR tries to flag is mostly for anything that looks really suspicious. But in the case that I wrote this file, this could be used for a legitimate case. So now that I've created this macro, right, here's how the execution then works. As you saw earlier, right, macro goes ahead and calls out the obfuscated file. It goes ahead and downloads it, executes it. And as you can see here, I have a reverse shell in PowerShell. So how does this not get flagged by EDR? So this is the reverse shell that I used. This is one that I wrote a long time ago that I actually have in my PowerShell for pen testing guide that I did. And I had a bunch of people in the community reach out to me saying that, hey, your Joplin template's getting flagged by Windows Defender. I'm like, what? Like, why is it getting flagged by Windows Defender? And sure enough, the reverse shell that I wrote for this is getting flagged. So I worked with someone in our community who is a community monitor for offensive security. Goes by the name of Tristan, but online he goes by Ghost0x0, I believe. And he went ahead and wrote a obfuscation script and also wrote a good blog and article on how you can write your own obfuscator. So here's what it looks like when we run the obfuscation, right? This is the output that we have. So in the article, we talk about using PowerShell obfuscation to go ahead and change out the class names, change out certain variable strings. We also have PowerShell objects that we can utilize that do same functions, like system text ASCII encoding. We can use different strings for. And so with this obfuscation, it goes ahead and it takes our payload originally that we have, we throw it in through invoke obfuscation, PS obfuscation, and it goes ahead and actually creates an obfuscated PS1 file that we can then use. So if you want to check out the article, I posted that as a reference here. And I also have the tool that he created that I was able to help contribute with as well, that you can utilize as well on your engagements. But the point I'm trying to get to is that, yes, this is going to get flagged probably in the next couple of weeks. But at the same time, too, the article that Tristan wrote really shows you how you can create your own custom obfuscator. And the obfuscation that I've used through this tool for PowerShell has really bypassed a bunch of different EDRs in the past several months since he's released this tool. So some lessons learned that I want to give to you guys when you're creating your macro malware. Be patient. Seriously, be patient. I'm not a coder. I cannot code anything really crazy. It'll literally take me weeks to get some stuff done. And trying to code stuff in VBA and VBS can be a pain, right? There's a lot of trial and error that comes to place when you're trying to create your own macro. And also, like I said earlier, create your own obfuscation tools for your payloads, right? If you don't want your payloads to get detected by EDR or by, a defender that's trying to look at that, start creating your own. There's a lot of companies I know that started doing that. And that's something, if you're interested in getting it, check it out. Also, learn to use other applications to your advantage. I know PowerShell is heavily used, right? MITRE ATT&CK framework even states that too. But it's going to come to a point where maybe one of these days PowerShell is going to die. I don't think it will. Personally, myself, because I mean, you see the campaigns that are out there still running PowerShell to this day. But learn to use other programs, right? Windows 11 is going to start having some interesting programs that we could probably call back to. Audvar Mo, running the low-bass bins, right, has a bunch of different ones that we could probably start looking into as well, to start actually using applications to download our payloads, right, act as our droppers. And again, like I said before, macro techniques are constantly changing. There will always be some new different vector or some little secret that Microsoft has left us from the old days, right, that we could utilize to our advantage, or some APT group is going to find it. So if there are any techniques that you have that you find, I recommend you responsibly disclose them to Microsoft, right? Because that's the only way we're going to be able to get better in this world. Or if you think there's a big risk, work with your employer on it so that, that stuff out there in the wild doesn't get caught, doesn't get tracked, and hopefully doesn't cause, a critical impact to the world we live in today. So with that being said, if anybody has any questions, I can certainly take questions here. But if you want to be able to ask me about anything online, you can reach out to me on Twitter, Discord as well too. I'm in a bunch of different community platforms that you could find me on. But in the end, I hope you really enjoyed this talk. I am also really sorry that I couldn't show a lot of other different creative techniques that I've had. But hopefully in the future, I would love to do this talk again for other conferences, and maybe even again for Mystikcon as well too.
Well, thank you for your presentation.